It began not with tanks or bombers, but with a signal. A thin electric pulse leapt into the air from a transmitter on the Sicilian coast. Nothing visible, nothing loud, just a coded whisper sliding across the Mediterranean night. At 2:37 a.m., a German radio operator in uniform leaned over his table, hands gloved against the desert chill, and began tapping out a message bound for Tripoli. The words were unreadable even to him, a string of random letters scrambled by the intricate gears of a gray metal box marked Enigma. To the men of the Afrika Korps, Enigma was sacred, an unbreakable cipher, the beating heart of their communication. Every order, every request for fuel or ammunition passed through its whirring rotors. They called it der Schlüssel zum Sieg, the key to victory. But far to the north, in the quiet English countryside, another group of people was listening. Bletchley Park didn't look like the center of a war. From the outside, it was just an old Victorian mansion surrounded by hedges and gravel paths. Inside, however, the air vibrated with the constant rhythm of typewriters and teletype machines. Young men and women, many barely out of university, sat hunched over coded intercepts pouring in from listening stations across the English Empire: Cairo, Malta, Gibraltar, Alexandria. These signals came in fragments, distorted by distance and static. But to the analysts at Bletchley Park, they were clues in a vast, invisible puzzle. At the center of it all was Alan Turing, a quiet mathematician from Cambridge, with the awkward grace of a man who lived entirely inside his thoughts. He had been studying the Enigma problem since before the war, and by 1940 he and his team had built something extraordinary, a machine that could think faster than any human. They called it the bomb, a labyrinth of spinning drums and clattering relays designed to guess, test, and discard thousands of cipher combinations per minute. Each time the bomb stopped, a technician read the output and gasped softly. It meant one of the German codes had cracked open, even if only for a few hours. Then, like a diver surfacing from deep water, a flood of meaning would rush in. The first Enigma messages they solved were from the Luftwaffe, detailing bombing schedules over France and the Low Countries. But soon something new appeared in the radio traffic, a series of transmissions signed with a call sign beginning with R and referencing supplies, convoys, and fuel in North Africa. They were Rommels. By early 1941, the British knew the German High Command had sent a new corps to Libya, the WWII Corps, to support the faltering Italians. What they didn't know was that their every move would be shadowed by unseen eyes. In Hut 6 at Bletchley Park, Margaret Rock, a 30-year-old cryptanalyst, adjusted her glasses and pinned a new intercept to the board. The message, captured by a listening post on Malta, contained grid coordinates and fuel tonnage. Within an hour, she and her colleague John Harreville had aligned the bomb's rotors to test the possible key settings. The machine clattered for 9 minutes, then froze. A small light blinked. The decrypted text began to print. Supply column, leaving Tripoli 0600, destination Machili, escort light armored. Margaret whispered, "They're moving east." The message was sent immediately to Cairo, encrypted again, this time in Allied ciphers, and placed on the desk of General Sir Archibald Wavell. By dawn, British aircraft from 203 Squadron were already in the air hunting the convoy described in that intercepted message. When they struck, the German trucks exploded in a row of orange fireballs across the sand. From their radios, the pilots heard confused German chatter. Rommel would later write in his diary, "The English seem to know our plans before we execute them." Back in Tripoli, a German signals officer named Lieutenant Bauer frowned over his transmitter. He had been monitoring Luftwaffe frequencies when the reports came in: convoy destroyed, no survivors. He blamed the Italians first, then chance, then fate, but not Enigma, never Enigma. He said, "Perhaps the British intercepted visual signals, or they have spies on the docks." He ran a hand over the smooth black casing of his cipher machine, its 3 rotors set to that day's key. He said, "This cannot be broken." At that same moment, half a continent away, Margaret Rock was logging Bauer's transmission into her report folder. His voice, bouncing off the ionosphere, had been caught by a British listening post near Alexandria. She smiled faintly as the teletype clacked out the latest intercept header. Source: German Field Radio, Enigma traffic, North Africa. In the war rooms of London, few people yet understood how important these signals were. The politicians still thought in terms of tanks and ships, but the analysts at Bletchley Park were already beginning to see the truth. Wars of the future would be decided by information, not artillery. By February 1941, as the 1st Afrika Corps divisions landed in Tripoli, the code breakers were already inside Rommel's network. They couldn't read every message. Enigma's settings changed daily, but even fragments were enough to sketch the outline of a grand plan: troop movements, supply shortages, fuel convoys. When decrypted messages reached British commanders in Egypt, they often arrived faster than the original orders reached the German front lines. And still, no one could tell the Germans. The success of Ultra, as the intelligence stream was now codenamed, depended on secrecy. Only a handful of officers, those cleared to the highest level, knew where the information came from. To protect the secret, British and later American commanders had to invent cover stories for their uncanny foresight. They would pretend reconnaissance aircraft had happened to spot convoys, or that patrols had stumbled upon enemy units by luck. In reality, they were reading the enemy's mail. Inside the huts of Bletchley Park, exhaustion was constant. The workers lived in shifts, decoding through foggy nights lit by fluorescent lamps. Coffee, cigarettes, and static filled the air. The war they fought had no front lines, no medals, no glory, just endless strings of letters, columns of numbers, and the distant thunder of bombers over Europe. Yet every time the machine stopped with a click, someone would whisper, "We've got them." Back in North Africa, Rommel's men began to notice a pattern they couldn't explain. Convoys ambushed before departure. Fuel depots bombed the same day coordinates were radioed in. Troop movements intercepted en route. Lieutenant Bauer, watching his operators tap furiously at their keys, began to feel something he had never felt before: the weight of unseen eyes. He wrote in his field notebook, "They know too much. It is as if someone is inside our radios listening." He was right. They were. By the end of 1941, the secret war of signals was already tilting the balance. Before a single American soldier had stepped onto African soil, the foundations of victory were being laid by invisible hands across the sea: mathematicians, linguists, and operators who would never fire a shot, but who could destroy an army with the turn of a dial. The desert battles had not yet begun, but in the invisible ether above the dunes, the first war of information had already been won.
The desert was a perfect place to hide an army. until someone learned how to read the air. By early 1942, the Afrika Korps had pushed deep into Cyrenaica. Rommel's tanks rolled across the open sand like gray sharks, fast, elusive, impossible to pin down. The British Eighth Army had been beaten back to the Gazala line, and Cairo whispered the word everyone feared: retreat. But in a quiet compound 1,000 miles to the northwest, another kind of war was unfolding, one Rommel could not see. At Bletchley Park, the lights never went out. In Hut 6, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and exhaustion. The team of cryptanalysts, mathematicians, linguists, and engineers worked around the clock, turning raw intercepts from Malta and Alexandria into usable intelligence. Each message came in the same way, a strip of paper filled with gibberish, beginning with the words Heil Hitler. The Germans trusted Enigma completely. Each day at midnight, radio operators across the Afrika Korps reset their machines according to a master key distributed by Berlin. The cipher had 150 quintillion possible combinations, far beyond the reach of human effort. But Alan Turing's bomb machines could test those combinations faster than any mind. And when luck and logic aligned, the code fell open. On the night of May 23, 1942, one such message broke. Margaret Rock, pale with fatigue, watched as the teletype spat out the translation. Fuel convoy arriving Tobruk, 25 May 0400. Escort, Fliegerführer, Afrika. Within hours, the information was on the desk of General Ritchie, commanding the British Eighth Army. He ordered the Royal Navy's submarines to patrol the Gulf of Sirte and the RAF to strike the convoy at dawn. By the time the sun rose, the German tank divisions were still waiting for fuel that would never arrive. When Rommel launched his assault at Gazala on May 26th, half his supply lines were dry. His panzers struck hard, but within days their momentum began to fade. In Tripoli, Lieutenant Eric Bauer, the same signals officer who once called Enigma the key to victory, now sat at his radio table drenched in sweat. The desert air was heavy, static humming in his headset. His fingers moved automatically, pressing keys on the Enigma machine. He didn't notice the irony. Every letter he typed was another clue for the enemy. "Transmit complete," he said. "Supply report to HQ." His sergeant looked up. "Sir, the British, they seem to be waiting for us again." Bauer forced a smile. "Coincidence. They can't possibly know." But they did. In Cairo, a handful of American officers had joined the British codebreakers. The Signal Security Agency, the U.S. Army's nascent cryptologic branch, had begun to learn the art of radio intelligence under British supervision. Their chief, Colonel William Friedman, an austere genius from Washington, read the decrypted traffic with a mix of admiration and horror. He said, "We're reading the enemy's mail, and they haven't the slightest idea." Every day, the Bletchley team decoded reports from Afrika Korps Command. Ammunition shortages, medical status, logistics, tank numbers. They even read Rommel's personal communications to the OKW in Berlin, including his complaints about Italian incompetence. The intelligence stream, codenamed Ultra, was now flowing directly to British and American field headquarters via special liaison units, officers trained to handle top-secret decrypts. Their orders were simple: never reveal the source. Ultra was more than secret, it was sacred. At the Forward HQ near Mersa Matruh, one such officer delivered an envelope to General Ritchie. Inside was a single line: "Rommel intends to attack Knightsbridge Box, morning of 10 June. He frowned. "How do we know this?" The liaison officer's answer was always the same: from a source that cannot be named. That morning, British artillery was ready. As Rommel's panzers advanced through the dust, they met a storm of shells. The Germans were stunned. One radio operator shouted into his microphone, "How did they know?" Another cursed and slammed his headset to the ground. The British guns had been waiting for them, because someone, somewhere, had already read their plans. At Bletchley, Margaret Rock received the after-action report. The attack had failed. Rommel withdrew with heavy losses. She folded the message quietly. There was no celebration. Every victory here was silent. Meanwhile, Rommel was growing suspicious. His diaries from June 1942 reveal a shift in tone. The British intercept our convoys before they sail, our tanks before they move. There must be a spy, perhaps in Rome, perhaps in Tripoli. He was close to the truth, but looking in the wrong direction. The spy was not a man, but a machine. The following month, a new challenge arrived. The Germans upgraded Enigma with an additional rotor, expanding its complexity tenfold. For a time, Bletchley went blind. Messages poured in, unreadable, maddening. Turing himself sat at his desk for days, muttering equations, sketching new designs for a faster bomb. The tension was unbearable. Then, in mid-July, salvation came from an unexpected place. A captured U-boat near Malta carrying codebooks and Enigma components. With those keys, the team broke the new cipher within 48 hours. The invisible front came back to life. By August 1942, Allied commanders knew more about the Afrika Korps than Rommel's own adjutants. They knew his fuel reserves were down to 12,000 barrels. His Panzer III divisions were running on captured British petrol, and his supply ships were being sunk faster than they could unload. When El Alamein loomed on the horizon, Rommel was already a ghost fighting on borrowed time. The British knew every position, every weakness. One afternoon in late October, Lieutenant Bauer sat listening to the static hiss of the radio. A sandstorm howled outside. Suddenly, a coded signal burst through. Enemy tanks moving from south, unexpected strength. He froze. How can they know? Across the Mediterranean, in a dimly lit hut in Buckinghamshire, Margaret Rock looked at the decrypted sheet that had arrived minutes earlier. Rommel's units were regrouping for a counterattack. She handed it to her supervisor, who immediately relayed it to Montgomery's headquarters. Within hours, British artillery was retargeted. When the shells fell on Rommel's flanking forces at dawn, it was as if the guns had read his mind. From that day on, Rommel's radio officers grew paranoid. They changed call signs, shortened messages, even experimented with code words, but nothing worked long. Bletchley Park adapted faster. For the first time in history, one side of a war was inking inside the other's communications. It was no longer just a battle for land. It was a battle for perception, prediction, and control. By the end of 1942, as Rommel retreated toward Tunisia, one thing became clear to everyone on the Allied side. Information was now a weapon as powerful as any gun. And to the men in the desert who still trusted their machines, it was a weapon they never even saw being fired.
When the Americans came to North Africa, they brought tanks, ships, and men, but also something else entirely, a hunger for information. They didn't yet know it, but they were walking into a battlefield already alive with invisible warfare, where every word carried on the air could mean victory or disaster. By the summer of 1942, Bletchley Park's codebreakers had proven the impossible. Enigma could be broken, again and again.
But the war was growing larger than Britain's small army of cryptanalysts could handle. Every week the traffic multiplied. German, Italian, Vichy French, Japanese. The Atlantic convoys, the Mediterranean fleet, the entire Middle East theater, all of it filled the air with coded noise. The Americans were the natural allies for this next phase. The U.S. Army's Signal Intelligence Service, SIS, soon to become the Signal Security Agency, SSA, had been working in quiet parallel since before Pearl Harbor, under the direction of a man whose name would become legendary in cryptology, William Friedman. He was the son of Russian immigrants, a scholar of ancient alphabets who had turned his gift for pattern recognition into one of the most potent weapons of the modern age. Friedman had studied Enigma long before the U.S. entered the war. Now, as American troops prepared to land in Africa, his analysts began receiving ultra reports from their British counterparts. It was the beginning of a partnership that would outlast the war itself and reshape the future of intelligence. In Cairo, a new Allied communications center was being built inside a converted Italian hotel. The walls were thick, the windows blacked out, the air filled with the faint ozone smell of hot vacuum tubes. Here, American and British cryptologists worked side by side, their desks lined with shortwave receivers, typewriters, and endless stacks of coded intercepts. At the center of it all was Anne Christie, one of Friedman's brightest analysts, a young woman with sharp eyes and the patience of a chess player. Every morning she would sort through reams of raw intercepts collected overnight by listening posts on the Libyan coast. The American receivers, nicknamed elephants, could capture transmissions from hundreds of miles away. Most messages were meaningless, a constant hum of weather reports, logistics updates, and Italian chatter. But sometimes, amid the static, something precise would appear. Grid coordinates, movement reports, fuel tallies signed DAK, Deutsches Afrika Korps. When those lines came through, Christie's pulse quickened. She'd translate the call signs, strip out the filler code, and cross-match them against Bletchley's indexes. Each decoded fragment was like a puzzle piece slipping into place, revealing Rommel's next move. On October 23, 1942, the desert erupted at El Alamein. Montgomery's guns opened with a roar that shook the ground for 20 miles. Inside his command post, maps of Rommel's defensive line were pinned to the walls, accurate to the last fuel dump and tank trench. Much of that information came from Ultra. British and American codebreakers had intercepted messages revealing that Rommel's supply situation was catastrophic. His panzers were running on fumes, his artillery short of shells, his fuel convoys smashed at sea. Rommel himself, ill and exhausted, was in Germany seeking treatment when the battle began. His deputy, General Georg Stumme, was killed on the second day. The Afrika Korps fought bravely, but the outcome was already written in code, weeks before the first shot was fired. In Cairo, Anne Christie and her British colleagues listened to the intercepts come in, desperate German calls for ammunition, for water, for retreat. One after another, their frequencies fell silent. When Montgomery's victory was announced, the city erupted in cheers. In Bletchley Park, there was only a quiet nod and the faint click of a typewriter. They knew it would happen. Then came the next phase, the Americans' own entry into the Desert War. Operation Torch, November 8, 1942. The largest amphibious landing in history up to that point. 107,000 Allied troops storming the beaches of Morocco and Algeria. For the U.S. Army, it was a baptism of fire, and for its new SIGINT units, an opportunity to prove their worth. Friedman's teams had set up advanced listening posts in Gibraltar and Algiers, equipped with mobile intercept vans and high-frequency direction-finding gear. The goal? To locate and monitor every German and Vichy French transmission within range. One night, as the invasion convoys approached the coast, a German transmitter in Tunisia sent an urgent warning. Enemy fleet sighted west of Oran. Within minutes, British codebreakers in Malta and American analysts in Gibraltar had the message. The invasion fleet's position was compromised, but thanks to Ultra, the Allies already knew the Germans were watching. They altered course under cover of fog, and the inlandings went ahead as planned. It was the first time in history that two nations, Britain and the United States, fought a single war through the airwaves. The invisible battlefield was no less decisive. As the Americans advanced eastward through Algeria, new intelligence challenges emerged. Their commanders, Patton, Eisenhower, and the young Omar Bradley, were learning to use Ultra without exposing it. Orders arrived in sealed envelopes marked "For commanding officers only." The source was never mentioned. Sometimes when intelligence arrived too soon to seem plausible, officers had to invent cover stories. A reconnaissance patrol spotted the enemy, or aerial photos confirmed the position. In reality, the information had come from a radio wave captured thousands of miles away. Meanwhile, in a tent outside Tripoli, Lieutenant Eric Bauer still sat at his transmitter. The war around him was changing, but his faith in Enigma had not. Every morning, he set the rotors to the day's key and transmitted routine reports, convoy schedules, tank repair logs, weather bulletins. The idea that someone could read his words as easily as a newspaper was unthinkable. And yet they could. In Algiers, Ankara Christie handed Friedman a report bearing Bauer's call sign. It contained the exact coordinates of a fuel depot near Gabus. Within 48 hours, that depot was a smoking crater. When Rommel inspected the ruins days later, he shook his head. He said, "The British don't guess like this. They know." At the same time, something remarkable was happening inside the Allied command structure. American generals, once skeptical of British secrecy, began to see the power of Ultra. They learned to treat intelligence not as an accessory, but as a weapon, one that could shape entire campaigns. At Eisenhower's headquarters in Algiers, a top-secret room was built with steel doors and no windows. Only 3 people had access: Eisenhower, his intelligence chief, Major General Strong, and a British liaison officer from Bletchley Park. Every morning, new decrypts arrived by courier, flown in sealed pouches. They were studied, summarized, and passed to the front as sanitized briefings. The soldiers who followed those orders never knew they were walking paths traced by decoded German messages. By December 1942, the Americans were no longer students in the Shadow War. They were full partners. Their intercept stations blanketed North Africa, triangulating German transmissions, jamming radio frequencies, and sharing decrypts with Bletchley in near real time via encrypted teleprinter links. The cooperation was seamless, born of necessity. And though few outside the intelligence world would ever hear of it, it marked the birth of something new. A transatlantic alliance of codebreakers, fighting not with guns or planes, but with logic, electricity, and time. In a letter to Washington, William Friedman summarized it perfectly. For the first time in history, 2 nations are fighting a single war through the airwaves, the invisible battlefield, but no less decisive. Back in the desert, the Afrika Korps was in full retreat toward Tunisia. Their radio discipline was collapsing, messages growing frantic. Bauer's operators tapped out SOS calls that went unanswered. The static was full of ghosts. And somewhere, listening in the night, the Americans and British were already charting their next target. The Shadow War was no longer secret. It had simply become the new normal.
The desert at night was never silent. Even when the guns stopped, the air hummed with electricity. Short bursts of Morse, flickers of code, fragments of language that darted across the frequencies like fireflies. Somewhere in that invisible sea, the voice of the war was still speaking, and both sides were trying to listen. By early 1943, the battle for North Africa had split into two fronts. One fought with tanks and artillery, and another fought with antennas and typewriters. For every armored column that moved through the dunes, a dozen operators were crouched over their radios, whispering coordinates into the ether. And in that ether, unseen hands were waiting to catch them. At Bletchley Park, the analysts now called the German traffic from North Africa the desert net. The flow was enormous, so much so that even with the help of the Americans, messages often piled up faster than they could be decoded. Some came from Luftwaffe field headquarters, others from Rommel's own command units, and many from lower-level logistics networks whose chatter filled the frequencies with vital clues. Margaret Rock worked the night shift, her eyes hollow from lack of sleep. She could hear the steady clack of the bombing machine in the next hut, turning its mechanical wheels like a clock counting down the life of an empire. The more desperate the Germans became, the more they talked, and the more they talked, the more they revealed. On the other side of the Mediterranean, in a canvas tent at Sidi Bouzid, Lieutenant Eric Bauer tapped out his daily report. The Afrika Korps was in retreat now, hemmed in by Allied forces advancing from the west after Operation Torch. The supply lines from Italy were collapsing. The desert, once an ally, had become a cage. Transmit. Request air support. Situation critical. The Enigma's rotors spun, translating his plea into random letters. But nothing about the war was random anymore. The transmission was picked up by a listening post on Malta within minutes. The signal's strength and direction gave Allied intelligence his location within a few kilometers. The message itself was cracked 12 hours later at Bletchley Park. By dawn, British bombers were on their way. In Algiers, American and British codebreakers now worked as one team. The combined Allied SIGINT Center had grown into a small city of machines. Rows of receivers, teleprinters, and encryption terminals, all linked by humming cables. At night, the operators could hear the faint whine of sandstorms on the antennas outside. Here, Major William Friedman oversaw what he called the information front. Every decrypted German transmission was plotted onto a massive map that covered an entire wall. Red pins marked enemy units, blue pins showed Allied positions. Each morning, a courier carried an updated summary to Eisenhower's headquarters. The intelligence was astonishing. Allied commanders knew not just where Rommel's tanks were, but where they would be, because the Germans told them. Every time Bauer or one of his operators sent a report, the Allies adjusted their own plans. It was like fighting a chess match, where one player could see the other's notes. But even the masters of the invisible war could make mistakes. In February 1943, the Americans suffered their first great defeat at Kasserine Pass. The ultra-intercepts had warned of German troop movements in central Tunisia, but inexperienced field commanders misread or ignored the information. When Rommel's forces struck, they smashed through the thin American defenses and drove them back in chaos. For the men on the front, it was a humiliation. For the codebreakers, it was a revelation. Intelligence alone meant nothing if commanders didn't know how to use it. When the news reached Cairo, Friedman's reaction was cold and precise. He said, "We gave them the answer. They failed the test." The defeat forced the Americans to adapt. New procedures were written ensuring ultradata would be integrated into battlefield planning. Generals would no longer receive cryptic hints. They would get direct, actionable information, disguised as reconnaissance, but guided by decrypted messages. From that moment on,
Every American offensive in North Africa carried the invisible signature of Bletchley Park. The Germans, meanwhile, were growing paranoid. Reports from Rommel's signals office show an increasing number of security orders, shorten transmissions, change frequencies every 2 hours, destroy code sheets daily. In February 1943, the German High Command introduced an upgraded Enigma variant, the Sunflower Key System, adding new plugboard configurations and stricter discipline. But it was already too late. 2 months earlier, a British commando raid near Tobruk had captured an entire set of current Enigma codebooks. Combined with the earlier U-boat documents, this gave Bletchley a complete picture of the new settings. Within a week, the Sunflower cipher was broken. The Germans were effectively speaking in plain language again, only they didn't know it. As winter turned to spring, the tide of the Desert War reversed completely. Allied convoys flowed freely from Algiers to the front, while Axis supply ships were hunted down and sunk. Each time a German convoy left Sicily, ultra messages alerted Allied submarines of its route and schedule. Within days, the ships were burning. The men on shore called the Mediterranean the graveyard of fuel. By March 1943, the Afrika Korps was running on fumes. Its tanks were out of oil, its guns short of shells, its soldiers surviving on rationed water. Rommel, sick and exhausted, requested evacuation. In Berlin, his pleas for reinforcements were intercepted and read at Bletchley before they even reached Hitler's desk. Back in Algiers, Ankara Christie stared at a fresh decrypt. The message was from Rommel's replacement, General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. Fuel nearly exhausted. Air support limited. Morale low. Request permission to withdraw. She looked at Friedman. "It's over," she said softly. He nodded. "They just haven't realized it yet." In April 1943, the Allied codebreakers noticed something unusual. The German transmissions were growing erratic, filled with desperation. The disciplined patterns of Enigma traffic were breaking down. Operators were skipping protocols, sending unencrypted fragments. One message simply read, "We are surrounded." On May 12, 1943, the last coherent signal from the Afrika Korps was intercepted near Cape Bon. "We will fight to the end. Long live Germany." Hours later, silence. The next day, Allied headquarters received confirmation. Over 230,000 Axis troops had surrendered in Tunisia. The campaign was finished. At Bletchley Park, the news was met not with celebration, but with a long, heavy silence. The operators, the mathematicians, the translators, they all knew what it meant. Their war in the desert was over. Margaret Rock stood outside the hut for the first time in days. The sun was setting behind the old mansion, and the air smelled of rain. She could still hear the faint echo of the bombing machines clattering inside. Somewhere across the sea, Rommel's radios were quiet. The frequency bands that once crackled with life were empty, now filled with static, the sound of defeat. The desert had consumed its armies, but the real battle had been fought in the space between words, between frequencies, between people who never met yet shaped each other's fate. The battlefield of signals had gone dark. But in its silence, something new had been born, a way of fighting that would never again disappear.
The war in North Africa ended not with an explosion, but with silence. When the last German transmission from Tunisia faded into static on May 12, 1943, the operators at the Allied listening posts removed their headphones and simply stared at one another. For months they had lived by the rhythm of enemy code, those metallic voices tapping through the night. Now The air was empty. Lieutenant Eric Bauer, captured near Cape Bon, sat under the canvas of a prisoner tent, staring at his wrists. His Enigma machine had been smashed with a wrench before surrender, standard protocol. But it didn't matter anymore. The British already had hundreds of them. Somewhere in London, men and women had been reading his every word for 2 years. He could not comprehend it. "Impossible," he muttered to a British interrogator. "The Enigma has 150 quintillion combinations. It cannot be broken." The officer slid a cigarette across the table. "And yet," he said softly, "we've been listening to you all along." Bauer's face went pale. The idea that the enemy had been inside their system, inside their minds, was more devastating than defeat itself. The Afrika Korps had not just been beaten, it had been outthought, undone by men and women who never saw a battlefield. At Bletchley Park, the victory in North Africa was a triumph of intellect and discipline, but it was also a secret so immense that it could not be spoken aloud. To the outside world, the Desert War had been won by Montgomery's tanks, American logistics, and sheer numerical superiority. Only a handful of people knew that behind every battle, a quiet army of mathematicians had already cleared the way. In Hut 6, Margaret Rock packed her papers into a wooden crate marked Classified, Ultra. The order had come down from London. All records relating to the Afrika Korps decrypts were to be sealed indefinitely. Even within Bletchley, only those with the highest clearance would ever see them again. As she closed the lid, she felt an odd emptiness. For years, her world had been nothing but codes and voices, fragments of lives she had never known. Now, those voices were gone. Across the Atlantic in Washington, Colonel William Friedman drafted a report for the U.S. Army's Signal Security Agency. It summarized in calm bureaucratic language one of the most extraordinary achievements in military history. Through continuous interception and cryptanalytic cooperation with our British allies, the majority of German Enigma traffic in the Mediterranean and North African theaters has been successfully decrypted, yielding decisive operational advantage. This success represents the first large-scale application of information as a strategic weapon. He paused before adding a final line. The lessons of this campaign will define all future wars. Friedman was right. The principles of Ultra, global interception, real-time analysis, joint intelligence, would become the blueprint for a new kind of power. In the ruins of Tunis, Allied troops discovered the full extent of that power. Inside abandoned German headquarters, they found Enigma machines stacked like trophies, boxes of code books, frequency lists, and radio logs. Many were still warm, as if their operators had left only moments before. American intelligence officers loaded everything onto trucks bound for London and Washington. Each machine, each page of cipher keys was a monument to arrogance. The belief that mathematics could be absolute, that a machine could outwit a mind. In the weeks that followed, technicians in both capitals built replicas of the captured devices, studying their flaws. What they learned there would one day fuel the birth of digital computing itself. The line between code-breaking and computer science was thin, and the men who had spent years wrestling with Enigma's logic now turned their skills to building new machines that could think faster than ever before. The Shadow War had opened a door to the future. But in 1943, that future was still secret. After the victory, Ultra vanished from public view. The name was erased from reports, replaced with the bland phrase, "from a reliable source." Even Eisenhower, supreme commander of Allied forces, was forbidden to mention it in his memoirs. The thousands who had served at Bletchley Park were sworn to silence. They could tell no one, not their families, not their comrades, what they had done. Many died without ever revealing that they had changed the course of the war. Margaret Rock returned to her pre-war life as a schoolteacher. When former students asked her what she had done during the war, she smiled and said, "Office work." At reunions decades later, she would sometimes see familiar faces, men and women who had once shared that endless hum of radio static, that unspoken understanding. They would nod to one another in silence. They didn't need to talk. They knew. In Germany, meanwhile, the myth of Enigma's invincibility collapsed slowly. Post-war interrogations of captured officers revealed how deeply the illusion had been believed. Rommel himself, in his last months before the Normandy invasion, still trusted the same system that had betrayed him in Africa. When the truth finally surfaced in the 1970s, it rewrote the history of the entire war. Historians began to realize that Ultra had shortened the conflict by years, perhaps saving millions of lives. For the men like Eric Bauer, who had once sworn by the perfection of Enigma, that revelation was a second defeat. He lived quietly in Bavaria after the war, working as a radio repairman. Sometimes when he tuned a set and heard the soft hiss of static, he thought of those nights in the desert, how he had sent messages into the void, believing they vanished. Now he knew someone had been there, listening all along. At Bletchley Park, the machines are silent now. The bombs stand still, their gears locked, their wires corroded. The huts have become a museum, and visitors wander through rooms once filled with the music of decoding, the hum, the click, the whisper of discovery. In one of the glass cases, a single sheet of yellowed paper rests beneath a light. It is an intercept from 1942, labeled in faded ink, Afrika Korps, message intercepted, decrypted via Ultra, source North Africa. Below it the translation reads, "Fuel convoy delayed. Rommel requests air support." The note is simple, almost mundane, but it carries the weight of a war turned by knowledge, a reminder that victory was born not only from courage, but from comprehension. The men in tanks and the women with headphones fought the same battle, separated by oceans, but bound by the same truth, that in modern war, information is power, and silence the sound of defeat. Epilogue. Years later, historians would call Ultra the secret weapon of the West, but those who lived it knew better. It wasn't a weapon, it was a mirror. It showed that every machine, every code, every empire, no matter how invincible, could be understood, predicted, undone. The Desert War ended long ago, but its lesson remains. The first great victory of the information age did not come from a bomb or a bullet. It came from a signal, a whisper across the air, and from those who learned how to listen.